What's up, everybody? Coach Mills here, coming at you with a brand new Valve video. Unfortunately, I had the sickest intro ever planned, and we had it all recorded, but we got a copyright strike, so we're gonna have to settle for this one for now. Now, in this video, we're gonna be breaking down the brand new patch 2.02 weapon tier list, because a lot of things have been changed with the change of the rifles and the change of the meta. A lot of weapons have become better or worse, so we're gonna be breaking all that down so you know exactly what weapons to use so that you can dominate your ranked games. But go to the GameLeap website in the links down below for in-depth advanced guides, VOD reviews, mechanical tips and tricks. We got everything you possibly need to climb in the links down below. But without further ado, let's jump into the video. Now, right off the bat, we gotta talk about the S tier, the best of the best guns, guns that dominate the meta and guns that you should be pretty familiar with either how to use or how to counter. Now, first, let's talk about the Phantom versus the Vandal debate. And you might be asking, okay, why are we revisiting this debate when both of these rifles got changed? Well, the thing is, the Phantom was a weapon that you would abuse the running and gunning aspect of it far more. And now that that's nerfed, it doesn't really hurt the Vandal as bad because yes, it's really difficult to run and gun with the Vandal, but you weren't really doing that in the first place. So it's actually a slight buff to the Vandal, and even pro players such as Hiko have stated that maybe it might make the Vandal quite a bit better, even maybe rivaling the Phantom. Now, that being said, both weapons have their strengths and weaknesses. While the Phantom is going to be the more reliable and consistent gun, easier to control your spray with, easier to spray through smokes with without getting seen, the Vandal is going to be a lot better for taking those long-range 1v1 duels, and that gun is going to really thrive depending on where you're pushing and what character you are. For instance, characters that can get a really aggressive kill and get out, like Reyna and Jett, are going to be better on the Vandal or better using the Vandal rather than another random character using the Vandal. So that's just something to keep in mind. But still, even with these nerfs, both these guns are in S tier. But the interesting thing is our S tier has changed more than it ever has, with two guns in the S tier that you might not expect at all, in the Stinger and the Frenzy. And you might be like, whoa, what the freak? Stinger and Frenzy in S tier? Absolutely. So to first lay a little bit of legitimacy into my claim, First Tense tweeted out this after patch 2.02 dropped. He said, really was hoping that Frenzy and Stinger got nerfed. And for those of you who don't really know what's going on in just the ranked meta as a whole right now, especially at the higher ranks, right now there is a ton of force buying and basically just hard rushing on pistol rounds with Stinger. Stinger plus armor is becoming a staple. A lot of times players will just full rush a site, or they'll always make sure to refrag each other with frenzies. And here's the thing, the problem with a weapon like a Ghost is you don't get to rock that armor, and when people are literally routing in a way where they're on top of you, you only get one shot off before you die, and you're never going to be able to kill an enemy with one shot. This leads to a lot of scenarios where even Reynas are maybe rocking one flash, baiting their team, rocking a frenzy, getting that refrag kill, and then getting 150 health, and then being unstoppable with the frenzy. So the frenzy is dramatically changing how pistol rounds are being run, and honestly, it is legitimately the best secondary weapon to rock. You're rocking pretty much any gun in the game. Having a frenzy to almost guarantee that you can run and gun, trade some damage with the enemy, that is a way to make it so if you ever get the enemy to low, you ever goosh them, you ever hit them through wall bangs, or you maybe leg them with an op, whatever, you can finish them off with the frenzy. And frenzy's seeing more and more play, and honestly, there's a lot of really free pistol rounds just rocking frenzy and light armor, and it's something I would highly suggest you use and abuse because I think it's going to get touched up at some point in the future. Now, the next weapon that I wanted to talk about is the Stinger, that is also an S tier, and basically the power level of the Stinger has made it so players almost always force. Saving after you lose that first round doesn't happen all that much because Stinger just has such a high chance of converting up in value. It is so good for aggressive base rushes, especially when the entire enemy team don't have rifles. They can't stop or position in a way to stop a rush, and all you have to do is catch one person off guard using an aggressive jet dash or anything like that, maybe an aggressive ability combo. You get to trade up in value, you get to push in an angle that cuts off rotation, and you get to get another kill because the Stinger just gets to clean up in that 1v1, a true 1v1. Stinger wins the matchup such a high percentage of the time, and it's gonna get worse. Frenzy and Stinger actually get better in this environment when Phantom and Vandal both got nerfed due to the recent patch in 2.0. So that's something that you need to understand. Because they didn't touch Stinger here, Stinger is going to be absolutely insane, especially in the hands of characters like Reyna and Jet in those force rounds or even in those eco rounds. Sometimes you could be the only one to buy, get a lucky break, get a Phantom or a Vandal for one of your teammates, and then you just roll through the rest of the team from there. Incredibly powerful gun, and because they dramatically change how the game is played in force rounds and pistol rounds, both of these weapons actually make it in my S tier. Now, let's talk about the last weapon in the S tier, a weapon that people are still kind of sleeping on, but is still very powerful, and it's none other than the Operator. The Operator is still a weapon that you always have to have at the back of your mind, and a lot of players still need to learn how to consistently jiggle peek an Operator, and even if you play correctly up against an Operator, a really good op user is going to be able to consistently get kills, especially on defense, and this is one of those guns that can really shift the tide of a game where you're winning, the enemy finally saves up, and one of them buys an Operator, manages to get a couple picks off of it, and then snowballs round after round using the Operator as their advantage. And honestly, a lot of you should be learning at the very least how to use the Operator to post up on an angle, but put a little bit of time and effort into mastering this gun, and you're gonna be able to clutch up or win a lot of games where you had an initial disadvantage. Now moving on to the A tier, these are weapons that are still very good. They're used a lot or all the time. They're not quite as meta defining as the S tier, but they're still very, very powerful. First off, we got to talk about the Classic, which did actually receive that nerf a little bit ago. And while the weapon is definitely nerfed when you're jumping and using subsequent fire, it still can one-tap people out of nowhere, especially if people just swing around the corner and you're holding it ready for them. The Classic is still a very good weapon, and a lot of times in pistol rounds, if you're playing a character that really depends on a ton of your abilities, such as Breach, rocking that Classic pistol is probably one of your best bets, or rocking that Classic in armor might be in some cases better than the Frenzy, especially if you are up against ghost pistols. Now, the next thing in A tier is the Sheriff, a weapon that is going to be pretty good and is very good at trading up in value, especially if you have good gunplay fundamentals, good counter strafing, good crosshair placement, things like that, and is actually a weapon that is really good up against some of the longer distance weapons in the game, like ARs and even Operators, depending on how you set up the engagement. But that being said, the reason that it's down in the A tier, not in the S tier, even though it can trade up in value, is because it's about the same price as a Stinger, and a lot of the time you are going to get more value on average with the Stinger than the Sheriff, even if you're a lot better or really good with the Sheriff. So I wouldn't blame you for picking the Sheriff, especially if you're playing towards the back of the pack. You know, you're maybe a controller or a sentinel and you're playing back and trying to get those refrags and those wall bangs. But if your team altogether is actually going to be buying or forcing for eco, Stinger is typically going to be better at refragging, and Sheriff is going to be better for doing like solo lurk missions, trying to catch enemies off guard and getting those really cheeky one-taps and upgrading your gun. Now I'm going to the next weapon in the A tier, another weapon that is just completely destroying the idea of a save round, and it's the freaking Bucky. Now yes, the Bucky is absolutely oppressive in certain situations. I mean, it's an extremely cheap weapon, and it has the capability to one-shot from a really rather large distance away, while being able to one-shot from up close as well. The Bucky can be used on attack and defense, and as long as you control the right amount of distance between you and your target, and you get used to that alternate convergence fire of the Bucky, it can be a weapon that can allow you to get 2Ks, 3Ks, really add up onto the enemy with damage. You can jiggle peek corners and still alternate fire with this weapon. It is a weapon that can allow you to clutch up and win a round that you really had no business winning, and especially on characters that can either challenge from an alternate angle or they have some form of mobility, the Bucky is absolutely phenomenal for those forced buy rounds. Now the last weapon in the A tier is actually the Spectre, which is a weapon that does get buffed technically from these nerfs to the rifles, and the reason that this is the case is because running and gunning on the Spectre is the same. It's still really good, while running and gunning on these other weapons aren't as comparable. So using the Spectre to run and gun at someone with an AR can definitely make yourself a lot harder to hit, and they're not going to be able to return the favor by spraying you back with bullets as consistently as you are. So it's a weapon that is still very good. If you play with it aggressively and you run and gun with it a lot more, play into that power level of the weapon, it can be good against players, for instance, with an Operator if you get close to them, or other ARs cards like Vandals. So definitely don't sleep on this weapon. And another benefit of this weapon is to distance yourself from weapons like Buckies and Stingers and still have a really large clip for actually dealing with multiple targets at the same time, rather than the all-in nature of some of these other force buy weapons. Now let's move on to the B tier. These are weapons that are good in their select situations, but they are by no means meta-defining. First off, we got to talk about the Bulldog, which is a weapon that did get a nerf. It suffered the same nerf that all the other rifles received, and while it still can be a legitimately good buy, especially if you win that first pistol round and you want to upgrade to a weapon that scales better, it is really going to be lacking a little bit when you compare it to some of the other force buy options that we already talked about, aka the Stinger and maybe even the Bucky. But having one person that buys up to the Bulldog, maybe stays towards the back of the pack outside of the effective range of some of these guns and can burst some people down, consistently refrag from longer ranges, that's not too bad, especially when the gun scales rather well up against rifles. Not amazing, but still pretty decent. I wouldn't blame you for using this weapon or upgrading to this weapon as long as you get used to controlling its spray in short bursts. Now the next weapon in the B tier is actually the Ghost Pistol, a weapon that has seen a fall all the way down from like the S tier all the way down to the top of B tier. And really, the Ghost Pistol is seeing less and less use for no better reason than the fact that the frenzy and rushing with armor is so powerful, and just having armor in general almost gives you more or better time to kill numbers than having a Ghost Pistol, because in the classic armor versus Ghost Pistol matchup, the classic armor can take a headshot and the Ghost Pistol of course can take a headshot, but the classic pistol can also one shot with the right click and get more consistent damage while doing something like jumping in the air. So you take all of that and you add the fact that having armor and a classic is $100 cheaper, and then you compare that to the frenzy, where if you're a Ghost Pistol person on point and enemies route in a certain way, there's not really much you can do against a team that is rushing on top of you, especially if they pop a Reyna blind, they're rushing you with frenzies. You're just gonna get killed so freaking easily, and unless you're specifically setting it up, playing in the right areas to make use of that really long effective range, Ghost Pistol might not be the easiest way to get consistent value. Now the next weapon in the B tier is the Judge, which is a weapon that is still very good. One of the big problems of the Judge is the fact that it's pretty expensive compared to something like a Stinger or a Bucky. I know I keep mentioning that, but it is rather expensive for a weapon that you would only really buy in a force or if you could barely afford it. And the Judge is also a lot weaker than the Bucky when you're talking about attack versus defense. Judge is very good on defense. If enemies swing you, run into you, you can clean up entire teams if they push into you. But when you're on attack, you can't really use the Judge all that consistently because you don't really have a means to get into the enemy team. Now, sure, you're rocking something like Raze or like Jet and you have a form of mobility to get into the enemy team. Yeah, that's fine. But the Bucky can be very useful, jiggly peeking angles and challenging the mid ranges, even if you don't have any form of mobility, and the Bucky is quite a bit cheaper, so that's why the Judge is relegated to the B tier, even though it can be a very powerful weapon. Now, the next weapon in the B tier is the Ares, a weapon that is here because it's not only cheap, but it performs a very specific job. The fact that it has a rather large magazine and you can abuse it on characters like Sova mean that it's really effective depending on where you're holding in certain places, and it's actually not that bad when you compare it up against some of the eco buys that you can find around its price point. It's really not much worse than buying something like a Spectre. So it's a weapon that you want to use in certain scenarios if you're the appropriate character, but it's definitely not a weapon you want to use all the time because, like I said, there are other weapons at or lower price point that can get more guaranteed value on average. Now, speaking of value, let's talk about the last weapon in the B tier, which is the Marshal, which is a weapon that can be the most amount of value for only 1100 credits. But the thing about the Marshal is it's very, very difficult to use. Hitting that headshot is pretty hard for a lot of people, and even if you're really skilled at sniping, it can be difficult if enemies play around it in a certain way. But that being said, one of the benefits of the Marshal is it's actually really good up against other oppers, for one, because you can pretty much quickscope with the Marshal, and when you're on those eco buy rounds, as long as you get that first shot in from a very far distance away, jiggle peek behind, even if you only hit them in the body, doing 101 damage to the body is enough to make it so you can finish them off easy with your classic pistol. And of course, the Marshal has this X factor where if you are feeling it, if you're popping off and you get a couple of headshots up against some rifle users, it can clutch you up an entire round by itself, which is really, really amazing for such a cheap gun. So if you put in a little bit of time and effort into practicing this gun, it might even be an A tier gun for you or whatever. But because of its difficulty to use, I don't see it ever becoming a meta tier weapon. Then we're going to the C tier weapons. These are weapons that can get some value in very niche situations, and a lot of times players are buying these weapons because it just fits in that perfect price point. But first off, in the C tier, we got to talk about the shorty. And yes, the shorty used to be a very good weapon when players really didn't play around the shorty. But the problem with the shorty is it has a rather all-in nature. Yes, it's only 200 credits, but the all-in nature of the weapon means that it's really not that much better, if not better than at all, than the classic pistol, which can still one-shot players with its alternate fire. And the classic pistol is for the low price of free. A lot of times, if you want to make the difference, it's going to be better, you know, spending that 200 credits buying an ability. And you might be asking, okay, well, I can buy an ability anyways. Well, maybe it's better for you to upgrade to a better force buy weapon rather than the shorty. Yes, you're going to catch some people off guard with the shorty, but I think it's only going to work if enemies dramatically misplay against you, and it will almost never work on attack. But moving on to the next weapon in the C tier, we have the Odin, which is a weapon that is like the big papa to the Ares. The only big problem with the Odin is its expensive price tag. Yes, it wall bangs through walls. Yes, it has a gigantic 100-round magazine and does quite a bit of damage. But when you compare the Odin directly to the rifles that are at a cheaper price point, it's gonna be better for you more often than not to buy those rifles. And if you really want what that wall bang provides, you're gonna get a pretty decent amount of that same value just rocking the Ares for a lot less money. Now you might be saying, hey, I use the Odin all the time and I pop off with it in my games. And you know what? That's great. But here's the thing. When players get a lot better at using rifles, if you are ever in a situation where you are crouched spamming an Odin, you're gonna get headshot just like that. I guarantee it. You're not gonna stay alive to kill the enemy team. And yeah, you could still pull off these really amazing wallbang plays, but unless you are just absolutely dripping with money and in one of those scenarios that the Ares was already good in, that's the only time that I would say you could justify buying that Odin. And then the last weapon we have in the C tier is the Guardian, which is a weapon that is okay, but I've consistently rated the Guardian very, very low, even though a lot of you in my comments seem to freaking love the gun. Now, I will admit it feels freaking good to kill multiple people with the Guardian. That being said, basically how the meta has devolved, Guardians are just going to be really, really bad up against any of the SMGs that people abuse or the running and gunning weapons. Things like Bucky, things like, of course, that Stinger. Guardian is going to have a pretty difficult time shutting down those weapons. And on top of that, the Guardian has consistently just been completely outclassed by the two rifles, the Vandal and the Phantom. So if you are in a price point where you could perfectly buy that Guardian, a lot of times it's better to save that money, pocket that money, and buy one of the better guns that we talked about, some of those cheaper guns that you can pocket that money and save it for later, or if you can afford it, just buy rifles. So that's kind of why Guardian's in that really weird space. And honestly, if you want a gun like a Guardian, just buy a Sheriff for a lot cheaper amount. And really, if you got the aim for it, you're gonna get about the same amount of value with a much higher potential upside because there's less investment. Now, the last weapon that I gotta talk about, the absolute worst weapon in the entire game in the F tier, is the Glitch Pop Axe. That skin is absolutely, no, I'm just kidding. Y'all got freaking baited. Anyways, sorry. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you agreed or disagreed with anything on my list, definitely let me know in the comments down below. And go to the GameLeap website for in-depth advanced guides over every single one of these weapons, breaking down the damage numbers and everything you could possibly need to master all the gunplay in the game, including in-depth aim fundamentals and guides. We got it all for you on the GameLeap website, so do yourself a favor. Go check it out in the links down below. But thank you so much for coming by. That's all I got for you today. I'm Coach Mills, and of course, see you tomorrow.